and now invites Sar to talk about the principle of precaution and in particular how we can minimize risk in populated areas. Thank you, Sar.
I think it's one of the most interesting and the most, I think, underutilized rule in the law of armed conflict or international humanitarian law. But the use of it in this application is, if it's done properly, it actually will enable armed actors to better adhere to the principle of proportionality, to adhere to ensure that they are adhering to distinction, and basically ensuring that the risk to civilians is reduced. So I'm going to talk a little bit, just discuss some of the provisions, and then I'm going to apply it in practice based on what I've seen in my work in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, as well as my engagement with various armed actors. I've written an article about some of these measures that were taken in Somalia and in Afghanistan. It's in your reading package. But again, I will draw in some examples that I have seen in its applications by some militaries. So the first one is, in the conduct of military operations, constant care shall be taken to spare the civilian population, civilians, and civilian objects. And I would argue that this basic constant care obligation has to extend to all aspects of military operational trainings, plannings, and mission execution. Soldiers are trained to fight. They are empowered to use the most sophisticated and most powerful weapons to neutralize the enemy, to neutralize the threat. So they're given a lot of power. But at the same time, we want to inculcate, and the law requires, the balancing act of military necessity with the principle of humanity and trying to reduce the impact of war on civilians. So what you want to try to build in a soldier, in an armed actor, is this ethos also of humanitarian and protection. And therefore, I think there's constant care in reminding soldiers and armed actors that you do have an obligation in every aspect of your fighting of taking constant care. Now, with respect to attacks, what are the precautions that can be taken? It says, do everything feasible to verify the objects are neither civilians nor civilian objects, and they are not subject to special protection, but are military objectives, and that you should take all feasible precautions in the choice of means and methods of attack with the view to avoiding, in any event, to minimizing incidental loss of civilian life, injury to civilians, and damage to objects. This basically means that a commander in the planning phase has to assess, where are civilians present, has to assess what is the terrain that one is fighting in. Is it an urban area, is it a rural area, at night, during the day, where civilians are mainly congregated, especially if you're fighting in populated areas. Where are certain protected structures, water treatment facility, critical infrastructure that civilians rely on. Where are schools, where are hospitals, where are religious structures, where mainly predominantly residential areas. So it is as part of your planning phase, a commander has to get a really good understanding of where all the civilians are present, where all the civilian objects that one is required to try to protect and try to reduce harm to these protected entities. So it is an obligation that they have to constantly get information on, and in their planning, in their mapping of how they're going to be doing operations in a particular area. This also means that they have to when they decide what sort of weapons they use. I think this is a very important thing, that you have to ensure that your unit, is trained on how to use, is familiar with the weapons that they are being given. A lot of times, unfortunately, some armed actors have a lot of weapons that they don't know how to use properly. They don't know what the result of how these weapons are going to impact civilians, especially in a very crowded area. And so again, the obligation of the commander is to ensure that the means and methods of warfare, choosing an appropriate weapon system system, the munitions, etc., should not cause disproportionate harm to civilians, because the language of Article 57 is about taking feasible precautions with the view to avoiding and the event to minimize incidental loss. Now, a lot of times, and unfortunately in this day and age, a lot of the battles that are being fought are in cities and urban areas, and so civilians are the ones that are impacted the most during the fight. You've seen it in the news. There's a lot of civilians are getting harmed or injured during battles. You've seen it where medical clinics, hospitals, water treatment facilities are damaged during conflict. And a lot of times, armed actors, unfortunately, are using munitions that will really cause a lot of harm to civilians, because some of these munitions, because they're indirect fire weapons, or they're large bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, for example, that when they land in a very crowded area, the perimeter of its impact and the blast fragmentation from these munitions is so wide that civilians and civilian objects are going to be impacted. One of the challenges is that so again, the commander has to ensure that the appropriate weapon system is being used for the area that you're engaging in, and nowadays there's a lot of sophisticated technology that you can fuse, you can calibrate your weapon so that the blast fragmentation is reduced. However, there still are complications when some of these weapons are used in very densely populated areas, just because these weapons are just a little bit more problematic to use in these areas rather than in open battle spaces where there's less civilians present and when there's less civilian infrastructure. So again, this is the responsibility of the commander to make all of these assessments in the planning phase, ensure there's proper guidance given to his or her unit and making a decision on the appropriate munitions use. I mean, one of the ways that in the planning phase that some militaries do, and yesterday in the evening, Professor Schmidt was talking about the U.S. and NATO and some of the Western militaries have this very sophisticated collateral damage estimate methodology. And I don't know I think most of you were there yesterday, but it was a very interesting presentation. But again, it's a computer system. It's like all these metrics go in, and it allows a commander to foresee what the effects of these munitions will be, and then decide on civilians and civilian objects, and then deciding whether it's possible to use, or in the case of in the U.S., whether higher command authority and approval is necessary to use this. I'm leaving aside the proportionality argument in this example, but I would sort of suggest that you don't need a very sophisticated computer systems to assess where munitions are going to land. I mean, I think it's great, but I think most countries, most militaries just don't have that. So I think when other countries are giving weapons to another country, or you are purchasing weapons, then you should know how to use these weapons properly, read the manual, and you should know where they're going to land. I've had so many conversations with armed actors and commanders, and, they're using different types of mortars, rockets, or, grenades, artillery, and when you ask them about, well, do you know how far it's going to land, and do you know, and I think there's like a lack of understanding of how these munitions are where they're going to land and how it's going to impact civilians. So, but the commander does have an obligation to know and take the means and methods of warfare, and to ensure that they are not causing incidental harm and they're minimizing incidental loss to civilian lives. Another thing that is very important is that again, sometimes, during the planning phase, you have more time to assess, where civilians are present, see where the pattern of life is of civilians, where they're moving in and out. But, in the heat of the battle, when you see your enemy, or you see that the enemy is firing on your units, you want to protect your unit, and you want to engage with the enemy and neutralize that threat. So a lot of times, they're called dynamic strikes or targets of opportunity, where they're both is about neutralizing the threat but also protecting your unit that's under attack. It's where a lot of mistakes are made. we've seen this time and time and again, and we've been fortunate to actually, with some militaries, they do make some of their assessments on civilian harm public, so you're able to learn about what happened during calling in those kind of strikes. But you see in most incidents, most cases of civilian harm are during these dynamic strikes, the targets of opportunity, because there's less time to plan and think and know what's going on. But I would argue that there still are ways to try to minimize it. And we've seen that, for example, in Afghanistan, the U.S. military, the ISAF, the NATO forces, did try to reduce, even in those situations, in dynamic strikes, they try to take some measures to try to reduce civilian harm and question and try to get a little bit more situational awareness, even in those dynamic strike cases. And one tactic that they used was, when forces are under attack, you can, try to take cover. Tactical patience, I love it. Try to take cover, protect your forces, and then wait for a while to see if you can get better situational assessment, understanding where the fire is coming from the other side, where the civilians are present, and then again, constant care obligation to make sure you're using the appropriate amount of force in response, or whether you think you can withdraw to seek cover and then find a better opportunity to engage with the enemy. So this falls into the argument of, refrain or cancel an attack. If you think that the calculus that commanders make, that if the military advantage is going to be excessive, the harm to civilians is going to be excessive to the military advantage, then you can cancel or suspend the attack. Again, the precautionary measures, taking feasible precautions at the time of the attack, you have to ensure that that the incident, the harm to civilians is being minimized. You have to constantly do this risk assessment in all phases. So the other way that one can learn how to reduce civilian harm in targets of opportunity is, after operations happen, is how you're going to learn from what happened. So what we're seeing slowly, militaries trying to do after action review, battle damage assessments, but that now are taking into account the impact on civilians and civilian objects. So there's a bit of a learning that militaries are trying to do, and we're encouraging militaries to do, that to see what are the better ways to learn from what happened during a particular incident and try to avoid making the same mistakes in the next incident. I should also just mention quickly the feasible precautions. Article 57 also talks about giving effective warnings to civilians. And again, you don't want to, I have sometimes these conversations with armed actors, they're like, oh, we don't want to tell people when we're going to launch an operation. I understand that. You don't want to, the enemy, the element of surprise is essential. But again, as part of your constant care obligation, there are ways to communicate with the civilian population, with maybe community elders, etc., that at some point in the near future, we're not going to tell you exactly that military operations are going to happen. So civilians should try to leave if possible, or try to seek shelter and safety. Sometimes civilians are prevented from leaving by the armed actor that is holding that particular territory. We've seen that particularly, and very sadly, in Iraq and Syria, in the case of the Islamic State, which basically hides in civilian areas, uses civilians as human shields, and has prevented civilians from leaving, and when they try to leave, mows them down with snipers. That does not relieve the attacking party from taking precautionary measures, ensuring their proportionality and distinction, and taking all feasible precautions in their attack. Just because one party is violating all the norms of humanity doesn't mean that the other party does the same. And there still is an obligation to ensure that proper communication, there's warnings are being given to communities before attacks are happening, if possible, to try to create safe routes for civilians to flee. Again, I do think this is all about taking feasible precautions, constant care, and reducing incidental harm to civilians. It's all about some of the things that you can do for risk mitigation, avoidance, and I think this is a very an interesting. I would argue it should be one of the core obligations of LOAC, because, and I don't know why it's just not discussed enough. So I'm a big proponent of this provision. I find it very useful to explain to armed actors that there are ways that they can take precautionary measures. So I think I should leave it at there. I'm sure there'll be lots of questions. I'm sorry, Mike.
But what's really puzzling me is like, how come that, or how do you explain that 500,000 Iraqis were killed during the war against Iraq, not to mention what's happening in Afghanistan with tens of thousands of people are killed by the American army.
The thing about the U.S. military has made mistakes. I mean, it's very clear and it's documented. And in Afghanistan, this article that I wrote for the ICRC reviews looks at how the U.S. military and NATO forces started realizing that when in the fight against Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, civilians were getting killed. And they started developing protocols, better measures on trying to reduce harm to civilians. So the article, it spells out a little bit about some of the guidance that came from the top commanders, from all the various generals about protecting civilians, trying to refrain from doing air attacks in residential areas unless absolutely necessary, and the highest commander to approve it, in limiting the use of certain weapons in residential areas. There was these collateral damage estimate methodologies were developed in the 2000s. Again, this is sort of new way of getting better information on fighting. And then ISAF NATO forces also started, as I mentioned, my comments, assessing how their operations were impacting civilians, and they were trying to analyze what was causing civilian harm, and then learning from it and then adjusting their tactics, providing new guidance to soldiers, providing new trainings on civilian protection. And in Afghanistan, there was a lot of documentation of numbers from the UN about how many civilians were being killed by international forces. And then once some of these measures were being implemented, there was a reduction in incidents attributed to international forces. Again, the law doesn't say zero civilian harm. The law says the obligation to reduce and minimize and mitigate civilian harm, and that military advantage should not be excessive to civilian harm. So again, the obligation is to minimize and reduce incidental harm, and unfortunately in battles there can never just be zero civilian deaths, injuries, objects. So there's a bit of some of these measures that were taken. It also depends on how they're implemented, how much emphasis command puts on protection of civilians and adherence to the law of armed conflict, and sort of includes it in all phases of operations, I was saying, taking constant care. On the Iraq post-2003, I'll leave Mike to sort of address that a bit more. Laura may have.
Oh, I can address it in just a general matter. Both presentations, both last night and today, were not meant to convince you that we can conduct surgical warfare. Anyone who's been to war, anyone, there are people in this room, knows it's hugely complicated. You may have misidentifications of targets because of time of day or because of weather. You have weapons malfunctions. In the first Gulf War, we had a lot of problems with heat-seeking missiles because of the fires that had been created. We didn't anticipate that the fires would cause the missiles to skew, and the missiles would skew and go ballistic and kill civilians. And then there's lots of human error because, as you see, it's very, very complex, and it's easy to make a mistake.
My second question is about, this is for all the panelists, I don't know who's going to answer it, is about establishing civilian communities within unoccupied territories while these communities are armed, fortified, and properly trained for their mission to protect the area in which they are living. Can they be defined as a legitimate target in times of hostilities?
There was a question on the settlements and whether they become a military objective or not. So I think we need to separate it's clearly two issues. The first one is the question of the settlements in and of themselves, and you alluded to the fact that they are problematic. In our view, as is publicly known, state cannot have a settlement policy and encourage the transfer of his population to occupied territory. That's violate Article 49, paragraph 3 of the 4th Geneva Convention, and we are clearly on the record for that. Now, this, if I can put it this way, is irrelevant for targeting purposes. It's a violation of the 4th Geneva Convention, but it's not relevant for targeting purposes. For targeting purposes is only the rules on targeting. So whether the civilians who are there and who might be armed, then if hostilities start in the occupied territory, then whether they take a direct part in hostilities or not, and if the place, the building, the fortification that might have been built around are used in a manner that turn them into a military objective, then they become military objective and lawful target. And if they don't, then it's not because they are a violation of the 4th Geneva Convention that they could become a lawful targets. That's really two completely different issues.